Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or votes objected to under Clause 6 of Rule 20. The House will resume proceedings on postponed questions at a later time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.J. Res. 139.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
House Joint Resolution 139, a joint resolution proposing an amendment to the Constitution of the United States requiring a balanced budget for the federal government.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1115, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, each will control 30 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on H.J. Res. 139.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today our national debt exceeds $38 trillion and grows second by second. On a per-person basis, the national debt amounts to more than $113,000 for every person living in the United States. For generations, Congress has chosen to max out our national credit card and leave the bill to the next generation instead of having hard conversations about spending. Families across our nation have had these hard conversations, and they balance their budgets. Their leaders of this nation should do the same. Americans know that debt comes with strings attached. Every dollar we spend beyond our means today is a dollar and change we must repay tomorrow. It's no different for government. And the more America borrows, the more expensive every next borrowed dollar becomes. Indeed, annual federal spending on interest is now one of the largest line items we have. We spend more on interest than we do on Medicare. We spend more on interest than we do on national defense. Republicans and Democrats may have different policy ideas and priorities, but surely we can all agree that a budget hamstrung by huge interest payments benefits nobody. Our fiscal trajectory is alarming and unsustainable. Higher than expected interest rates or other challenges could trigger a debt spiral. It's happened to other countries throughout history. Without changes, it will happen to us. The day of reckoning will come, and it will not be big and beautiful. It will be big and ugly. There are 2 choices: spend a lot less on the future or spend a little less starting today. I choose the second option, and that's why I support the balanced budget amendment. It is the only way to submit our commitment to long-term fiscal stability. A 5-year path to balance will allow us to make prudent spending choices to gradually balance the budget and wean us from our reliance on deficit spending. It's simple. The balanced budget amendment will restore fiscal sanity and take us off the path to an economic calamity. But the balanced budget amendment will not merely beat back a future fiscal crisis. It will also reduce the cost of living here and now. The enormous federal debt is currently driving up borrowing costs for all Americans. Mortgages, car payments, student loans are all more expensive because of Congress's profligacy and irresponsibility. We saw the disastrous effects of budget-busting deficit spending during the catastrophic 4 years of Biden-Harris rule. With the eager support of Democrats in Congress, the Biden-Harris administration approved $4.7 trillion in new deficit spending, ultimately racking up $8.5 trillion in new debt. And what did the average American get? The worst inflation in 40 years. When Biden-Harris took over in January 2021, inflation was just at 1.4% per annum. By the middle of the term, it exceeded 9% per annum. Inflation is a tax on everyone, but we all know who it hurts the most: the poor, the working class, seniors on fixed incomes, and American families who saw their expenses explode and their salaries stay flat. Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
So ordered.
I rise to oppose H.J. Res. 139, this feeble attempt by the President's budget-busting, blank check enablers in Congress to distract America from their own staggering and historic fiscal irresponsibility. Everyone knows they control the House, they control the Senate, they control the White House, and they've used their total power over our federal government to drive our country into a deep ditch of deficits, debt, illegal tariffs, undeclared wars, and economic destruction. After adding $4 trillion to our national debt with their tax breaks for the super rich, every Republican in the chamber but Representatives Massey and Davidson voted to allow President Trump to keep spending between $1 and $2 billion every day, not of his own money, but of our money, on his unauthorized and unconstitutional war in Iran, without so much as a single vote or a single honest debate on the floor of the House. This war of choice and aggression, which is spiraling out of control now in the Middle East, and which President Trump now calls a little excursion, has already cost 13 American service members their lives and wounded over 200 Americans in uniform while killing more than 1,000 Iranian civilians, including 170 children at a girls' school that was bombed in the first week of Donald Trump's war. But still our colleagues sit there passive, invertebrate, and complicit in the face of this brazen usurpation of congressional war powers, rising from their constitutional stupor only to vote no on our war powers resolution, which every self-respecting member of the Article I branch should have voted for. The administration reports that the first 6 days of this war cost the taxpayers $11.3 billion, or $1.9 billion a day. Have Republicans come to the floor to explain why this war was necessary or to offer evidence of an imminent threat posed to the American people? Have they asked for a special Iran war tax to demonstrate their fiscal responsibility? No. They just put Trump's little excursion, as he calls it, on the national credit card like an impulse trip to Disney World. But our constituents are paying through the nose for this historic folly right now, not just as taxpayers, but as consumers. We've already been buffeted by Donald Trump's illegal tariffs and imbecilic trade wars against the rest of the world and the soaring cost of living under his corrupt economic policies. But now we also have to contend with skyrocketing gasoline prices thanks to their foolish disruption of the global oil supply. Gas prices have shot up more than 25% since the lawless mullah theocrats of Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz after the lawless MAGA theocrats of America bombed Iran. Now, our Republican colleagues present a doomed proposal to deface our Constitution with the same kind of witless, self-incriminating graffiti someone recently scrawled on the exterior front wall of the Kennedy Center, which they called the Trump Kennedy Center. This proposed constitutional amendment pretends to address a problem that the Republicans created and that Republicans have refused to address legislatively, even though they have all the political control and all the legislative tools they need at their disposal to address it. We don't need a balanced budget constitutional amendment. We just need a balanced budget. If you believe in a balanced budget, bring us one. Show it to us. You control the Congress, but don't start a fiscal wildfire with your out-of-control spending and then throw the Constitution into the flames too. If this proposed amendment were in effect today, the GOP-controlled Congress would be forced to pay for Trump's war by further cutting critical programs for America's working families. And if we gain a majority and try to repeal the $1 trillion tax cut that they handed to the wealthiest 1% of Americans, we would have to get a 2/3 vote in the House and a 2/3 vote in the Senate in order to engage in that act of fiscal responsibility. But if they wanted to pass another $1 trillion tax cut for Elon Musk and the richest Americans, they would only need to get a majority vote in the House and the Senate. Mr. Speaker, even Republicans are denouncing the gigantic runaway deficits that result from out-of-control Republican spending and stupendously reckless Republican tax cuts for billionaires and giant corporations. One of our GOP colleagues, Representative Chip Roy, described their one big beautiful bill as garbage prior to the House vote, saying, if we're going to do the tax policy, at least do the spending policy. Have the courage and fortitude to do what you campaign on when you're talking about balancing the dang budget. Well, Representative Roy's outrage makes sense. Republicans control the House. They control the Senate. They control the White House. Yet they've not once balanced the federal budget or even tried to present a balanced budget to Congress. Their obscene, ugly, profligate law added a jaw-dropping $4 trillion to the national debt because of their massive giveaways to billionaires and corporations, which is the true political mission on their side of the aisle. They paid for a fraction of their profligacy by stripping health insurance and food assistance from tens of millions of working-class Americans who are now living with their Marie Antoinette policies concocted by billionaires and cyber barons throwing great Gatsby parties at Mar-a-Lago and bulldozing the White House to build themselves one more gilded ballroom. So now, rather than showing some discipline and hard work and reversing some of their terrible fiscal blunders from the past to propose an actual balanced budget, no, they waste our time to keep the party going by inviting us to spend the day finger painting on the Constitution of the United States. To observe the semi-quincentennial of the country, they want us to use our Constitution to make them do what they claim they want to do, but refuse to do at a time when they possess all the power they need to do it. And with the same foresight and expert planning the White House has used in their chaotic forever war in Iran, they will put our government into a fiscal straitjacket forever to cover up for their gilded incompetence and misplaced priorities. It would mean, for example, that a responsible leader like Franklin D. Roosevelt or Bill Clinton would no longer have the flexibility to deal with economic crises created by Republicans like Herbert Hoover or Calvin Coolidge or George W. Bush. The simple truth is we don't need a constitutional amendment to balance the budget or have responsible fiscal policies. They've got one-party control of every branch of government. They never stop talking about balanced budgets. Why don't they just bring us one? That's all we need to do. But billionaire rip-off artists like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel, they don't get rich off of balanced budgets. They get rich when the GOP opens the spigots of taxpayer money in federal government contracts and giveaways for billionaires and the high-flying, rent-seeking corporate class. Republicans have run up historic corrupt deficits this Congress and have never once submitted a single balanced budget. We don't need a constitutional amendment to force the majority to do the right thing. We need a new majority. Republicans may as well introduce a constitutional amendment saying that federal agents shouldn't shoot American citizens in the face for exercising their First or Second Amendment rights, or a constitutional amendment saying that federal agents shouldn't shoot someone 10 times for lawfully carrying a firearm in Minneapolis. You don't need a constitutional amendment to respect the law, and you don't need a constitutional amendment to do the right thing for the American people. You just need a new majority, and my friends, it is coming. I urge members to oppose this foolish diversionary legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, histrionics and misdirection won't cover the historical hypocrisy of the reckless spending of Democrats, who now even choose to keep parts of the government shut down. Under the Biden administration, the national debt grew by an unprecedented $8.5 trillion. And by the way, this used to be a bipartisan issue. When you mentioned Bill Clinton, I think, yeah, that's the last time everybody came together from both parties that actually produced a balanced budget. And you say, well, why don't Republicans do it now? Because we'd like to invite you to do it with us. We would like to invite you to do it with us, but you don't want to do it with us. In fact, you just basically announced you'd like to repeal the Tax Act and give us the largest tax increase in national history. What did we get for the runaway spending of Joe Biden? When Biden and Harris took over in January, inflation was at 1.4%. By the middle of the term, it was over 9%. The One Big Beautiful Bill Out will reduce debt to GDP, flip primary deficits into surpluses by 2034, and reduce the deficit by about $4.5 trillion relative to the policy baseline prior to an enactment. All of this while averting the largest tax hike in American history that my colleague across the aisle basically just announced they're going to enact upon the American people if they become the majority. Democrats have proposed radical bills that far exceed the alleged cost of the One Big Beautiful Bill. Let's see what they've done. The Green New Deal will cost $93 trillion over 10 years. That's theirs. Medicare for all, their proposal will cost $32 trillion over 10 years. So forgive me if I think they're projecting a bit on this one here. Simple truth is a balanced budget amendment would hold both parties accountable, and I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to my friend from North Carolina, Mr. Harris.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, all Americans understand something very clear. We don't have a revenue problem with the federal government. We have a spending problem. And Congress has the power of the purse, but we have failed to exercise such authority responsibly. Our national debt currently stands, as of this morning I understand, at $39 trillion, which equals over $113,000 per citizen. And this number grows as I speak and will not stop without radical action from Congress. We have borrowed our children's futures to pay for programs we cannot afford, putting this country on the path to financial ruin. The only way forward is to set guardrails to ensure Congress can no longer spend money it does not have. This balanced budget amendment to our Constitution simply prohibits total spending from exceeding the average tax revenue collected in the 3 years prior. While critics may argue that reducing spending will somehow harm the economy, this amendment allows Congress 5 years to adapt to the new requirements. The amendment also sets a 2/3 majority voting requirement for any new taxes to prevent politicians from taking more of your money to spend rather than doing the hard work of fine-tuning our budget. Despite what some opponents might say, there is no way to tax our way out of this situation. As I said at the beginning, all of America knows there is a spending problem, not a revenue problem. And I urge full support of this amendment, and it is past time to balance our budget. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
And yields back. The gentleman from Arizona reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad that the gentleman from Arizona has conceded that the last time we had a balanced budget was under President Bill Clinton, the elected Democratic president for 2 terms, who turned over a surplus of hundreds of billions of dollars to his successor in office. Now compare that to President Trump, who has been president for a total of around 5.5 years and has added a quarter of the national debt from George Washington all the way to today. A quarter of that has come from Donald Trump himself. So look not at what they say, but at what they do, because it is the Democrats that have always been the party of fiscal responsibility, and like they're doing in the Iran war right now, they're spending us into oblivion without even coming to Congress to get the war declared. It is unauthorized, much less telling us how they're going to pay for it, other than putting it on a credit card for our children and our children's children to pay for many generations into the future. I yield 1 minute to the very distinguished gentleman from New York, Representative Nadler.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I oppose this dangerous, dishonest, and undemocratic resolution. It's dangerous because it would require shredding the social safety net and gutting vital investments in health care, infrastructure, and public safety. It's dishonest because the same Republicans who hold all the levers of power can pass a balanced budget anytime they want, but instead they pass tax cuts for billionaires, creating trillions of dollars in deficits. And it's fundamentally undemocratic because it bakes in policy choices that should be the decision of future Congresses. Each Congress elected by the people should decide the contours of its own budget. This resolution requires a 2/3 majority to raise taxes, but only a simple majority to cut taxes. That puts a thumb on the scale for massive spending cuts rather than ensuring that billionaires pay their fair share. If my Republican colleagues believe so strongly in a balanced budget, they should pass one. But this resolution, which will never become law, is nothing more than a press release that lets them pretend to care about deficits without doing the hard work of actually legislating. Vote no. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find that the argument that is presented from the gentleman from Maryland seems delusional at best. Delusional at best. This amendment doesn't target programs, it targets overspending. Congress must live within the revenue Americans already provide, and that's about $5.5 trillion a year. The two-thirds threshold applies to tax hikes, not program cuts. Receipts have been stable for decades. Spending is what's out of control. Spending is what's out of control, and they fail to acknowledge it. What's delusional is for the Democrats to have the audacity to say that they're the party of fiscal responsibility when they're trying to impose the Green New Deal, $93 trillion over 10 years. I'm now pleased to yield 2 minutes to my friend from Georgia, Mr. Clyde.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of my friend Rep. Andy Biggs proposing a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. I was a proud co-sponsor of this republic-saving resolution, and I am proud to support it on the floor today. I also want to thank Speaker Johnson for bringing this resolution to the floor and fulfilling a promise that was made when we passed the One Big Beautiful Bill. As our national debt rapidly approaches $39 trillion, Washington is long overdue for a heavy dose of fiscal responsibility. It's not just irresponsible anymore, it's a national disgrace, and it's time to put an end to it. To put our debt into perspective, this year the federal government expects to bring in just over $5.1 trillion in revenue, but plans to spend almost $7.1 trillion. That's almost a $2 trillion deficit. Nearly $1 trillion of that spending goes to purely pay interest payments. No principal, purely interest payments, providing no new services, no investment, no return. If this were a private business, no bank would keep lending it money, yet this is how our federal government operates today. This trajectory is unsustainable. Global markets will not finance U.S. deficits indefinitely. When confidence in our ability to repay fades, we risk a true sovereign debt crisis. Collapsed pensions, failing banks, and shuttered federal programs. Despite Democrat claims to the contrary, our debt crisis stems from unchecked spending, not a lack of revenue. Without serious reform, we face two damaging options. Either one, print more money, which fueled the Biden-Harris inflation surge, or two, borrow more, which raises interest rates and slows growth. Notably, my home state of Georgia must, by law, operate with a balanced budget. So why not our federal government? I've told my constituents I aim to bring North Georgia values to Washington, and fiscal sanity is at the top of the list. As a fiscal hawk and member of both the Budget and Appropriations Committees, I look forward to voting yes, and I implore all my colleagues to do the same. Let's pass this balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Thank you, and I yield back to my friend.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, it is unchecked federal spending by President Trump, who's spending up to $2 billion a day on an undeclared, unauthorized, and unconstitutional war in Iran. And our colleagues won't utter a peep about it, and they won't bring us a balanced budget, but they bring us a balanced budget constitutional amendment. I will yield 90 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Representative Doggett.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
From the same folks who brought us $4.7 trillion in additional federal debt and who worship the king of debt, Donald Trump, as he describes himself, they present this unbalanced budget amendment. Apparently, this proposal, which reeks of hypocrisy, is designed by those who gave us so much more debt to protect us from them doing even more harm. But I think it really should be known as the Protect Our Billionaire Buddies Act, because that's what it's really designed to do, to prevent a future Congress from ever demanding a fair contribution from the billionaires and the multinational corporations who pay a tax rate lower than that for a teacher or a nurse and shift our jobs overseas. Our loophole-filled tax code has more holes than Swiss cheese. By imposing this first in history supermajority requirement before any tax can be increased, they prevent plugging those holes and do anything about the injustice and inequities in our tax code that shift the burden onto working people and small businesses. These Republicans aren't really deficit hawks. They are war hawks these days, and they created a special loophole in their own amendment for war to ease funding of the war machine. With Trump in office, we can expect more wars wherever his latest whim and ego take him, endangering all of us. There's nothing balanced about this amendment. Let's reject it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you. During the gentleman from Texas's recent comments, so recently given, the national debt rose by $125,000. So just keep that in mind. I'm now pleased to yield 2 minutes to my friend from Texas, the chairman of the Budget Committee, Mr. Arrington.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank my good friend and classmate from Arizona. Ladies and gentlemen, let's pause for a brief moment of intellectual honesty. Both parties have failed. This institution has failed. We have failed our country. We have jeopardized our economy, our security, our leadership in the world, and worst of all, we have compromised on our children's future and the blessing of their inheritance of freedom and opportunity. We have failed. That's why we're talking about a constitutional amendment to impose fiscal responsibility on a body politic that has not done that has not mustered the political will to do that, a national debt per GDP that exceeds World War II levels of debt, an annual deficit that is larger than both the defense and non-defense discretionary budget, 50 cents or greater on every dollar that we borrow of the $2 trillion going to service our interest payment. Half of what we borrow, $1 trillion, is more than what we spend on defense. And then there's this ominous forecast by CBO that even at $39 trillion today, where we're teetering on potential sovereign debt crisis, we will add $180 trillion to the national debt in the 30-year out. If that's not unacceptable to everybody, I don't know what is. And if we can't concede to the fact that this body politic does not have the political will to address it, to rein in the spending that's driving this unsustainable debt trajectory that will bankrupt our country and our children's future, then we must support this forcing mechanism. Force us to do what the American people have to do. Force us to do what state and local governments do. Here's another stunning and startling for some, but for all a sobering fact. We won't even get a simple majority vote today. So what shall we do? Well, we should look to Article 5 of the Constitution, where the sovereign states and we the people can petition their government for another path to amend the Constitution. Guess what? They've done that. If I could get just 20 seconds, Mr. Chairman.
30 seconds to my friend.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Well, in the late 70s and early 80s, they did that, and they had the requisite applications to have an Article 5 Convention of the States, to rein in us, the knuckleheads that refuse to accept that it's not a Democrat problem or Republican problem, it's an institutional problem that persists and will destroy the greatest nation in human history. So let's look to the states. And let's call that convention like we should have done in the 70s and 80s. And let's let them rein us in, restore fiscal sanity in their nation's capital, and reverse the curse that looms large over this country. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the gentleman for that refreshing intervention in the debate. But I think as the President Clinton example demonstrates, we can have and we have had the political will at different points to balance the budget. And so it's not politically impossible, but it does start with some people taking some courageous votes. For example, let's vote on whether or not we should be at war in Iran, costing the American people $1 to $2 billion a day. But if you can't even have the courage to decide that we will exercise our war-making powers and our power to declare war under Article 1, Section 8, and our spending power to do it, then nothing will save you. I'm sorry. You could pass a constitutional amendment saying don't shoot people in the face, but still you got to tell ICE not to shoot people in the face. You've got to demonstrate your commitment to actually making that policy real. I yield 2 minutes to the very distinguished legislator from Virginia, Bobby Scott.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about that Clinton budget. Clinton's budget passed when the deficit was $290 billion. The Republicans fought it tooth and nail, didn't deliver a single vote on that budget. When it finally got down to about $10 billion, the Republicans jumped on the bandwagon just before it was going to balance, whether they agreed to it or not, and they're prancing around like peacocks, like they had It was their idea all the while. They can get credit for 10 of the $290 billion of Clinton's deficit reduction. Now, for years, Republicans have been talking about reducing the deficit and doing nothing about it. If you look at what they did last year, added trillions of dollars to the debt in that big ugly bill. In fact, every Republican administration since Nixon has made the deficit worse and delivered a worse deficit to their Democratic successors. And every Democrat since Kennedy has produced a better deficit. And the reason we have a deficit today is because the Democrats haven't been able to clean up the mess as quick as the Republicans can make it. Now they come up with this so-called balanced budget amendment. It doesn't produce a balanced budget. In fact, it'll make it more difficult to produce a balanced budget. It requires a 2/3 vote to pass the budget. Let's get serious. You're not going to balance the budget cold turkey in 1 year without tax increases. And so we're talking about a 2/3 vote. And which is more likely, balancing the budget cold turkey or having a 2/3 vote without any limit to how bad the deficit gets? I think people have been around here long enough to know that it's going to be the 2/3 vote and it's going to be a horrendous deficit. Republicans have used their time to enact massive tax cuts for big corporations in the top 1%. They've exploded the deficit in the process. To balance the budget, Congress has to make the tough decisions to actually balance the budget. It's not going to balance itself. This amendment will actually make it more difficult to do, and that's why we need to defeat this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to set the record straight on that history. It was very colorful, a little bit inaccurate, because if you remember, it was a 96 budget that was balanced. And it was balanced with all the Republicans and a plurality of Democrats. Would have been nice if it had been unanimous, wouldn't it? It would have been nice, but it couldn't get there. And so when I come back and I say, look, perhaps all the rhetoric you've heard today is political partisanship. It's posturing from this side of the aisle over here. Maybe it's some from us, because it is a bipartisan problem. And I think the previous speaker just said, well, what's the odds of us ever just doing it on our own? That's right. Yeah, hell froze over once about 30 years ago. Are we going to wait 30 years again until the structural deficit exceeds $5 trillion a year, when you're actually having a national debt that is somewhere north of $100 trillion? Well, we're not going to last that long. We need to do this now. I now yield 2 minutes to my friend from Missouri, Mr. Onder.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this amendment to the U.S. Constitution to require the federal government to maintain a balanced budget. Republicans have warned for years about the dangers of unchecked federal spending, but because of the Biden administration's unprecedented spending spree and Democrats' ongoing unwillingness to return spending to pre-COVID levels, we are now at a defining crossroad. Within a few years, the debt held by the public will surpass every previous record in our nation's history, even levels reached during World War II. 2 years ago, for the first time in our nation's history, we began spending more on net interest on our debt than our entire defense budget. Interest has become the fastest growing category of federal spending and is now the second largest expense. When we spend more on servicing past debt than we spend on veterans, education, and transportation combined, it is clear our national priorities are dangerously off course. A constitutional amendment is necessary because previous attempts at curbing spending are not working. Congress's budget resolution process is routinely ignored, pay-as-you-go laws are routinely waived, and the debt ceiling has been referred to as a, quote, bad joke. And the results are now catching up to us. Amending the Constitution is indeed a drastic measure and should only be employed in the most extreme circumstances. But at almost $40 trillion in national debt, that is exactly where we are today. It's time to end the irresponsible spending spree. I urge my colleagues to support this balanced budget amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri yields back. The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I'm yielding 2 minutes to the distinguished former Majority Leader of the House, Steny Hoyer from Maryland.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I thank the chairman for yielding, the ranking member for yielding. The American people are obviously got to be so confused about this debate. Because one side claims they're bringing us an amendment, a balanced budget amendment, and their history has been, and I've been here for some time, Ronald Reagan increased the budget by 189%. Why do I say Ronald Reagan did it? Because he could have vetoed any spending bill. And we would not have overridden that veto. In 2001, we cut taxes, and we were told by our Republican colleagues it would raise additional monies. It did not. Then some of those, particularly who are claiming, well, we made a deal and we're keeping it, we're getting this constitutional amendment on the floor. What was the deal for? The deal was to vote for the big bad bill, which created $4.7 trillion of additional deficit, Mr. and Mrs. America. That's a tough way to want to balance the budget. We have a paying for problem. That's the discipline, a paying for problem, not a spending or revenue problem. What we have is a paying problem. If we would pay for things, which presumably this constitutional amendment would seek, then we would not have this continuing deficit. But you and I both know we're not going to do that, and you haven't done it. We haven't done it. Jody Arrington is right to that extent. This is a problem where we do not recognize the real problems of why we are so deeply in debt. And we pretend cutting nickels and dimes will make a difference. Now, they're big nickels and dimes, I get that. But the fact of the matter is, it is dishonest, in my view, for me or anybody else to come to the floor and say, I want to balance the budget, and then vote for the largest creation of debt ever on this floor. Defeat this amendment. Defeat this suspension bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the gentleman's comments. I think, in one sense, I think he's right on the money. Both parties can share in the blame of the massive national debt we have, the structural deficit we have. But I will point out that in 2001, when taxes were cut, something happened in 2001 which changed the trajectory of the entire nation, and we're still dealing with the fallout. Yeah, you'll remember it. We call that 9/11, right? Some things happened in 2001 which changed our spending. That's important to recall. I'm now going to yield 2 minutes to my friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to bankruptcy theater. Welcome to it. I am fascinated by my good friend on the other side of the aisle telling me that they are the party of fiscal responsibility. And let me just say, as others have said, including your former majority leader, that this is an institutional problem, because it is indeed that. But let me just make clear to the American people, they say, well, there's not a dime's worth of difference between Republicans and Democrats on spending. And to a certain extent, they're right. However, the Republicans are using a handcart on this railroad, and the Democrats are on some kind of bullet train on this train to hell. Like, as much as we have spent, and there are many in this room who have fought against the spending, I can't imagine how much worse it would be if we had to go to the Democrats for a vote. That's the problem. Some say, well, it's never going to become law. You know why it's never going to become law, Mr. Chairman? Because there are 7 Democrats in the Senate that refuse to vote to balance the budget ever. It's going to pass here, maybe, but it definitely won't pass there. That's why it will never become law. All the people I know that I represent have to balance their budget. Now, I will tell you, I went to the president and I said, Mr. President, we're spending too much money. You ran on cutting spending. I ran on cutting spending. We're spending too much money. And he said to me, you're right, Scott, but I can't get them to vote for less. And he's right about that. You folks tax and spend and tax and spend, and our folks are willing to spend without taxing enough. Now, I'm not saying that we should tax more. The American people are taxed enough, plenty. But we are overspending and continue to overspend. When I got here, I think the individual debt per person was like about $40,000. What is it now, $130,000? Ladies and gentlemen, this place cannot control itself. The American people are going to have to step in. This allows them the opportunity, and we ought to give it to them. I thank the gentleman for offering the amendment, and I thank leadership for honoring their promise. I yield the balance.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Well, I'm charmed by the story that the gentleman from Pennsylvania just told us about having gone to the White House to talk to the president and telling the president he's spending too much, which might be, I'm sorry? Okay, well, I'm just recording the story as was presented to us. You're spending too much, he said to the president, which is the understatement of the 21st century. He's spending $1 to $2 billion a day on an undeclared, unauthorized, unconstitutional war in Iran. He's given us 1/4 of all of the debt that's been created in the United States from George Washington until today. That's under the Trump administration. So the gentleman represents that he spoke to the president and said, you're spending too much. And the president's response was, I know we are, but I can't get them to stop spending more. Who is them? Was that an implied critique of the Democrats? Because they control the House, they control the Senate, they control the White House. So who is President Trump in that vignette referring to? Is he referring to the Republicans? He must be, because they're the ones who are controlling the chamber, as they're proud to tell you. At least until the end of this year, they are the ones doing it. If you think you support a balanced budget amendment, why don't you start with a balanced budget? Just bring us one balanced budget. That's all that we need from you. Now, they've taken what's a math problem and tried to turn it into a constitutional problem. Every family in America knows you've got to make your expenses come within your means, within your resources. Every family does that. But they don't want to do that. They want to turn what is a simple math problem, an economic problem, into a constitutional problem. So now, to celebrate America's semi-quincentennial, 250th anniversary, for the first time they want to say, what we need to do is to amend our Constitution to make us do what we want to do, but we can't do. We don't have the political will and courage to do it. Well, it was offered by the majority itself. We've got the will on our side to do it. President Clinton did it, and we fight to try to make our resources match up with our expenses. We've already heard their side of the aisle is looking for a $1.5 trillion military budget for next year. $1.5 trillion for the defense budget. That's what they want, or the war budget, I'm sorry, for the war secretary, for Mr. Hegseth. They want $1.5 trillion. That's where they're headed. So, endless wars in the Middle East, undeclared, wars of choice, wars of aggression, not authorized by Congress. None of them will even utter a peep about it today. That's where we are hemorrhaging money in America. Instead, they want to talk about a hypothetical pie-in-the-sky constitutional amendment that no other generation of Americans has ever needed before in order to do the right thing. Well, look, what is their loyalty and fidelity to the Constitution? Let's say they got their amendment. Well, right now, Article 1, Section 8 says Congress must declare war. Not the president, not Donald Trump, not J.D. Vance, not Tulsi Gabbard or somebody in their chat group. Congress must declare war. Well, what do? Nothing. They just let the president go ahead and enter into his wars of whim and caprice, vanity, conceit, imperial ambition, whatever. They do nothing. They won't even have a vote to support it or oppose it. They won't have an honest debate about it. Well, that's the war power. which Madison said was one of the essential powers Congress must have, because the kings were always plunging their countries into wars of conceit and vanity, imperial plunder and corruption, so it had to be vested in the representatives of the people, but they won't follow that. Well, how about the spending power? Exclusively, Congress has the power to spend money, and it's got to arise here in the House of Representatives. We've got the power to spend, and we've got the power to tax. Well, the administration's been struck down dozens of times for abusing our spending power, and they won't say a word about it. What about the taxing power? Donald Trump became the first president in American history to unilaterally impose tariffs, which is a huge tax on our people, not on other countries, not on China, on us. And we told them it was unconstitutional, and they wouldn't do anything, with the exception of Representative Massey from Kentucky, who's the conscience of the Republican conference, although I don't mean to damn him with faint praise, but maybe a handful of others opposed the tariffs. But they all went along for the ride, even though we've got the power to impose tariffs, and it's always been Congress that has established the framework for tariffs, not the president. You can't make it up as you go along, but that's what he did. And of course, he was struck down even by the Supreme Court that has been sliced and diced and gerrymandered to his advantage. Even that Supreme Court struck it down on a 6-3 vote, but we hear nothing from our colleagues about it. And what about the First Amendment? Right? There shall be no law abridging the freedom of speech, and yet this is the most anti-free speech administration the United States has ever seen. Donald Trump's chairman of the FCC the other day said that broadcast licensees, television stations, better watch out what they say about the war. You can't think of a more naked violation of the First Amendment than the government threatening to revoke broadcast licenses of media entities who disagree with the president's policy, especially about something as important to the American people as war. And they don't utter a single word about it. So that's their demonstrated fidelity to the Constitution. And now they're saying, well, yes, we're not balancing the budget. We haven't presented a single balanced budget. But if you make us do it through the Constitution, we'll follow the Constitution. Right. Fool me once, well, blame on you. Fool me twice, blame on me. We're not falling for that. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Maryland has 6 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Arizona has 11. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman is prepared to close and reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
We have no further speakers, and we're prepared to close as well.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for closing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to my distinguished colleague from Arizona for a spirited discussion of this important issue. I will take the example offered by the gentleman from Arizona of President Clinton. We could take many historical episodes, but we have time only for one. President Clinton was determined to balance the budget, and he returned hundreds of billions of dollars in a surplus to his successor in office. And he worked with the Republican-controlled Congress and led them along to eliminate the deficit. The government ran a huge surplus without the aid of a contrived balanced budget constitutional amendment, and Clinton bequeathed to his successor, George W. Bush, famously, a $236 billion budget surplus, which Bush and the GOP Congress quickly squandered on tax cuts for the richest people in the country, and then the staggeringly costly forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what do you know? History repeats itself. If it doesn't repeat itself exactly, it certainly rhymes. Because what do we have now? They've added $4 trillion to our debt with their massive giveaways to the richest people in the country and the richest corporations. And now, what are we in? Despite all of Donald Trump's campaign promises, we're in another undeclared, unauthorized, forever war of regime change. Although it's not really regime change war, because the president obviously doesn't care about democracy or human rights in Iran any more than he cares about democracy or human rights in America. But in any event, we are there. We're in that war, spending $1 to $2 billion a day. And so what do our colleagues do to try to deal with this fiscal catastrophe? They offer a balanced budget constitutional amendment saying this is a bipartisan problem we're in. It's a pox on everybody's house. Let's just amend the Constitution to make us do what we really want to do, but we can't do because we don't have the political resolve and the courage to do it. But at the same time, they don't have the political resolve and courage to exercise Congress's powers over war. They don't have the resolve and courage to exercise Congress's power over spending or over taxes or over our ability to regulate commerce domestically or internationally. They've given it all away to the President of the United States. When we are the Article I branch, we've got the power. We can do it if we're willing to exercise it. What's the President's power? Very simple: to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So we pass a balanced budget, the President will have to remain within it. If we say we're going to have a debate about that war, you can't just run off to war and start plundering the public fisc and spending billions of dollars of the people's money. He can't do it. But our colleagues in the majority will not exercise any kind of discipline or institutional self-respect. You know, the framers of the Constitution thought that people in Congress would stand up for congressional power, just like the President would stand up for presidential power and would always try to aggrandize the power of the executive branch, and the Supreme Court would stand up for the power of judicial review and what the courts do. But they thought that, as Madison put it in Federalist 10, ambition would counteract ambition. We would stand up for ourselves. Our colleagues in the majority will not stand up for congressional powers under the Constitution of the United States. So they want to finger paint some more on the Constitution by adding their balanced budget constitutional amendment. We don't need a balanced budget constitutional amendment, which will be a fiscal straitjacket in times like COVID-19 or times of war where Congress needs the flexibility. All we need is for you to bring us a balanced budget, show some fiscal discipline, show some fiscal resolve. Then we can take it seriously, but otherwise it just seems like a massive, fantastical distraction from what's actually taking place in America today and on earth, which is we have a president who is bulldozing everything from the White House itself to the Bill of Rights to the separation of powers. And what do we have on the other side of the aisle? Nothing but legislative accomplices in all of this fiscal and constitutional irresponsibility. So they want to take a simple math problem and displace everybody's attention by trying to turn it into a constitutional issue. Well, that wasn't the handiwork of James Madison. That wasn't the handiwork of Alexander Hamilton, who took balanced budgets very seriously. They didn't think that America needed it. If the political leadership is not rising to the task, then we need new political leadership. If this congressional majority can't do it, let's elect a new congressional majority. But let's not throw the Constitution into the fire with all of the other constitutional principles that have been set ablaze by this administration. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland yields. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, hyperbole and sophistry right here on the floor of the House from politicians. Who would have thunk it? I mean, really, who would have thunk it? I get a big kick out of that. You know what the national debt was when Barack Obama became president? It was $8 trillion. You know what it was when he left? $20 trillion. You know what the gentleman from New Jersey did? He defended every wild-eyed anti-constitutional program, every abuse of the First Amendment under the Biden administration. So when you had reporters being castigated, investigated, and prosecuted, not a peep from him. Not a peep! But boy, golly, he's going to come up here and attack President Trump. That's what he's going to do. And then he's had the audacity to talk about being a basement of this body. And to say that we have absolute control over all three bodies. I wish we did. That would mean we had 60 Republican senators in the Senate. Quite frankly, I got a major problem with that because that's a supermajoritarian body under the cloture rule. That wasn't contemplated by the founders either. They thought it would be a simple majority. And the rationale for his argument is, well, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton wouldn't have said it. But you know what? James Madison and Alexander Hamilton would have said, we're not going to have direct elections of senators. They're going to be elected by their state legislature. That rationale doesn't make sense in this argument. It's specious and weak. That's the rationale that you're throwing at us today. You said we've never needed a balanced budget amendment before. Well, perhaps you're correct, but we sure have a massive structural deficit today. We have a structural deficit because even though we bring in a record amount of revenue, we keep spending more. And this body doesn't have the political will. That's the point that our side's been making. We don't have the political will. Not on our side or your side. You want to turn this constantly into a partisan affair. I'm saying both sides have recklessly spent too much. Both sides. And you know who is punished by it? It's not us. It's not us. It's the American people. It's the American people that are taking the burden of feckless, blind spending, reckless spending. So even if you get the record amount of revenue, this body's not going to make a concomitant amount of spending. No, it's going to spend more. We'll always spend more. We'll always spend more. Only if we have a balanced budget amendment, which, by the way, used to be a bipartisan issue. Used to be a bipartisan issue that the national debt and deficit, both parties' national security leaders used to say, that is our number one security threat. I mean, for 25 years, a generation or more. We don't hear that today from these guys. It's too bad. I wish we did. Man, I wish we did. I wish we could both say, let's put this together. It's delusional. It's delusional. The fact of the matter is, what was spent during COVID? Yeah, massive amounts of literally trillions of dollars without any productive capacity to go with it. That fueled the Biden era inflation. And we're dealing with that today. Oddly enough, the inflation rate under President Trump is back down to almost what it was when he left. That's the reality. How about these guys saying, we're going to put in the Green New Deal program? Remember that one? Yeah, $93 trillion worth of spending with no pay for over a 10-year period. $93 trillion. Medicare for all, $33 trillion over a 10-year period. No pay for. You know what the pay for is? We're going to print more money. We're going to print more money. And you know what that does? That devalues your currency. By the way, devaluation of currency is the classical definition of inflation. Because you can't buy as much with the same dollar. You're always going to need more. People think that we've seen hyperinflation. We haven't seen hyperinflation. You know when we're going to see hyperinflation? We're going to see hyperinflation when the bond markets start saying, guess what? You guys are effectively bankrupt, and we're not lending you any more money. That is when the big calamity hits. And when that hits, there won't be anybody here who can say this is a partisan issue. Both parties will be at fault. I pray to God that both sides here today will vote for this amendment. Get it to the people. Let the people actually impose upon us what 49 states have, and that is a requirement for a balanced budget. If we couldn't print our own money, we would have already collapsed. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass House Joint Resolution 139? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In my opinion of the chair, two-thirds of the being of the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
Madam Speaker, I'm seeking recorded vote, please.
Does the gentleman ask for the yeas and nays?
I ask for the ayes and the nays, yes.
The yeas and nays have been requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number have risen, and the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings of this question will be postponed.